So today's July 4th, so I live in the US and I'm hoping it's not going to be too loud. Doesn't seem like the fireworks have started yet. So I want to talk about kind of a broad topic, but I really want to make this relatable to everybody. And hopefully it's all going to come together, because I kind of just have a vague idea of what I'm going to talk about. Now, when it comes down to it, right, when we're very young, like very young, we basically are born into this world feeling completely helpless. We have no clue what's going on. And we really rely on our caregivers. We rely on, our parents, right? Mom and dad, for everything. Because we're totally dependent. We're helpless, right? That's just how it is. That's just the nature of being an infant, a human infant. Like some animals are born, like have you ever watched like any animal, like I said, a giraffe being born, right? They come out and they can just walk. They can move. They're pretty developed when they come out. Humans, not so much. So a lot of the development happens years after we're born. And those early years are really pretty important. They really have an impact on us. And really, when we start to do emotional work, shadow work, go really deep, you start to really hit into these patterns that are, how should I say it? A part of you might even be kind of embarrassed that this is coming up for you. Because we tend to avoid these feelings. We tend to really go through our lives avoiding for instance, fear, helplessness. We really avoid that. But when we're children, right, when we're infants, very young, we can't avoid it because that's all that we're feeling. And the patterns that we form during those years actually stay with us, whether we like it or not. And so we kind of have to be humble here. We kind of have to not judge these patterns. And it can be hard though, right? It can be hard when your mind is incessantly it's fixating on something like a person, maybe a relationship or, something. And it might get really frustrating. Like, why does this keep happening? I'm fine, right? I'm fine just being on my own. But why does my mind keep fixating on this person or this relationship or whatever it is? So in order to kind of figure that out, we have to go deep. We have to really inquire and stay open to what we may not consciously know at the time. Like, you're not going to consciously know any of this because it's all buried. It's all in the shadow. It's like in your closet, in your basement. So what I want to talk about is kind of an interesting pattern that I've worked with in myself, and I've seen it with, of course, with everyone that I've worked with to some degree. This is just going to be the case for everyone. And it kind of starts to connect with attachment, which I want to talk about a little bit. And really, it starts to connect with also when I mentioned unconscious opposition, resistance. It all kind of connects to this. It's all the same. So basically, right, when we're really young, at some point we learn to hide our emotions. So a lot of this work is to kind of undo that hiding, to kind of undo the repression. And I feel like that's an important piece. It really is. But what I want to talk about also is what starts even before that. What starts before we're repressing the emotions. And it's very subtle, and it's hard to talk about this. But in essence, let's pick an emotion just as an example here. So fear, right? Because fear is really what we all avoid. It's really the bottom. It's the root of all these patterns. It all comes down to fear. And a lot of the sense of self and identity is really rooted in fear. So a lot of suffering comes from this. So it's really, can be, I think, helpful to explore this pattern. So at some point you learn to hide fear, right? You learn to repress fear. And this is, I think, pretty relatable for most of us, because what happens when you are afraid? Like, how do people react when you're afraid? Right? Especially in childhood, people might make fun of you. People might judge you, shame you, reject you. So, or get angry or whatever, right? So basically there's like a negative outcome. There's a negative response, especially from those that we care about. Maybe mom, dad, family, kids that we really want to be friends with. And so we learn, like, oh, this is not an okay emotion. Like, fear is not an okay emotion. I have to hide it, suppress it, pretend like everything's okay. I have to mask this feeling and pretend that everything's okay. And I've talked about this before, and this is not new, right? This is pretty common to start to connect with. But what's the other side of this? So if you just remember this kind of movement of unconscious resistance, which happens all the time, right? And so there's the movement of pushing down fear. But why does fear come up in the first place, for example? So feel into this, because in my life, this is pretty relatable, is before learning to hide fear, right? It was actually the opposite. If you think of like a child that's having a temper tantrum, right? Like a child that's just like really overemphasizing the emotion. Does this sound familiar? Like really like yelling, screaming, like I'm just so uncomfortable. This is so intense. Like what happens to that child usually? I mean, let's say ideally, what happens to that child if they really embellish the emotion? I mean, maybe your mind might produce rejection or, but ideally what happens is actually the opposite. Reinforcement, validation, sympathy, right? Support. Because as a child, before you're even able to speak, how do you get the attention of your caregivers, the people that you rely on for safety? How do you get their attention? Well, you can't speak, right? So flailing around, overemphasizing the emotion is a pretty natural way, right, to get what you want, which is the attention of your caregiver. So this is, I think, a really interesting pattern. Because in my own experience, right, like working with fear, I would be just feeling the fear, feeling it, and then noticing resistance, all that resistance, like I have to hide this, I don't like this, I shouldn't be afraid, I really can't be afraid, it's not okay to be afraid. So there's a lot of resistance patterns around fear. But I noticed that it kept coming back really intensely. And I was reading actually a book. So Angelo DeLullo, if you're not familiar, he's got a really good book called, I think it's just called Awake. And there's a chapter on emotions, which I highly recommend. I think it's really all you need for this. But there's this one little part where he talks about this. And I've never heard anyone else talk about this, how we learn to overemphasize emotions as children and that we actually get rewarded for that. And so I was reading this chapter and I realized, like, holy shit, this is right. This is so true. Because at the time, like, I was just trying to feel the fear, allow the fear, and then work with resistance. But it still kept coming back so intensely. And then I noticed, wait, first of all, that's a belief that that this fear is really intense. Like it's a thought. It's a belief. And could there be a need for this belief? Could there be a need to have intense emotions, to have intense fear? And what came up was surprising to me. It was like, yes, actually, because that's how I get attention and love. Whoa. And I just burst out laughing at that point because it makes sense. And I finally acknowledged the other side of that fixation, because really I was only working with primarily the resistance. And yeah, I was trying to allow the fear, but it was really intense. Oh, wait a second. This fear is really intense. Could there be a need to believe this? Could there be a need to have intense fear? And at first it makes no sense to the mind, like, you know, because we could still be identified with the resistance, but once you kind of clear away that resistance, allowing it, then the need for that fear comes up, the need to have intense fear, to really overemphasize the fear. So it's kind of like, I don't want, like basically this fixation was that I really need to hide this fear. I need to push it away and hide it because it's not comfortable. It's not even safe. Like I'll be rejected for having this fear. There's a lot of reasons why I need to push away and hide the fear. But at the same time, I really need this fear. I need it to be intense because that's what's going to get me what I want, what I need. It was so interesting to see this. And it started to really clear away. And what's interesting is I haven't really had intense fear since. Like, definitely fear has come up. But strangely, acknowledging that I needed it to be intense actually dissipated a lot of the intensity. And not that the intensity is a problem, really, but it's just interesting to notice how the belief was actually amplifying the fear, generating the fear. And then the resistance was pushing away the fear. And it was just this constant conflict. And I want to connect this to attachment, because attachment, so what is attachment? It's really simple. When we're children and we're feeling fear, right? We're feeling unsafe. We need a caregiver, right? So like an attachment forms basically, where it's like, okay, this person is going to keep me safe. They're going to give me what I need. Now, when that's not consistently available, which is going to be for everybody, it's just unrealistic to have a caregiver that's there all the time, especially one that's present and doesn't have their own stuff to work through. Basically, then some sort of trauma forms, and it could go a number of ways. Primarily, you can be anxious or you can be avoidant. And there's also disorganized attachment, which is basically like a combination of anxious and avoidant. So, first of all, I want to say everybody has actually both. Okay, it's not like, oh, you're avoidant and you're not anxious, or you're the opposite. And you actually, we all have both within us. Like I definitely primarily had avoidant patterns, but I still also had anxious patterns too, and vice versa. Like it's like men tend to be more avoidant and women tend to be more anxious, but it's not always the case. It's not black and white. And everybody has both, because primarily these are two sides of the same coin. They're both trying to resolve fear. They're both trying to get safety somehow through the other, through the caregiver, the source of love and safety. And so the anxious attachment's basically expressing that fear, like really like identifying with that fear, which is, I really need this person. I need them to take care of me, to fulfill my needs. And my survival depends on it. The other side of it is the avoidant pattern, which is basically the other side, which is, no, I don't need that. I'm just going to be alone. I don't need anybody. I don't need help. I don't need people, whatever, right? So it's really denying and avoiding the fear by clinging to really like a false sense of autonomy that I don't need this. I'm just going to not feel these feelings. Now, they're actually both sides of the same coin, because deep down in both cases, both the avoidant and the anxious is really just trying to be safe. That's it, right? It's trying to find security somehow. So the way that it all connects here is that if we're not aware even that, okay, that this is fear, right? Because I can tell you from experience that when you're in an avoidant pattern, you're not aware at all that there's fear, which is really the point of the avoidant pattern. It's more dissociative. But the anxious pattern too can be kind of, I mean, you're definitely more aware that you're anxious, but at the same time, it can be so subtle sometimes. And the behaviors can be very much reinforced, like being a good helper, being really nice, not rocking the boat, just listening and helping and being really nice and sweet, right? That too is a form of anxious attachment, basically expressing fear. Because really you're trying to get something. I think this is the crux of it, is that with both cases, with both avoidant and anxious, is that there is some agenda there. There is an agenda. And even the avoidant pattern, even if you're in that pattern, it's going to be really hard to admit this in the moment, but you really do just want to be loved. You really do just want to be supported and sympathized with, or you may not be aware of it, but it's like your mind is really trying not to think about that person, but they keep popping in. But I'm really like, I really don't care about this person. I'm just going to avoid it. So there is still that movement. It's trying to resolve itself. There's still an anxious movement. It's still being fueled by fear. And I think in the anxious pattern is just more overt. It's just more obvious. The interesting thing too is that in relationships, right, you tend to kind of attract the opposite. So like an anxious person will tend to attract an avoidant person. And it's interesting how they actually trigger each other. So I don't know if you noticed this, but like, let's say like if you're anxious, like you have that pattern, and if your partner is avoidant, and when they start to become more avoidant, like they start to kind of like not talk to you and kind of like, you can tell that they're avoidant. You can feel it. What happens to your anxiety? And vice versa. And then when you start to express that anxiety, what happens to the avoidant pattern? It starts to get amplified. And vice versa. So like the more avoidant you become, the more anxious your partner becomes. And it's interesting, isn't it? But really, they're both the same in the sense of that, the sense of what's fueling both is fear of losing attachment, losing the source of your love and safety. Basically a fear of being alone, fear of being abandoned, unsafe. And honestly, this is what fueled all these patterns, honestly, all of our shadow patterns. And I want to connect it to what I originally was talking about, which is this fixation with fear. And I think it's really helpful to notice, right? Notice when fear is operating. And you might really just be identified with the resistance. The sense of like, I'm not afraid. Like, I really don't want to be afraid. I don't want this. Primarily, I think the avoidant pattern is more identified with this. And then the anxious pattern is more identified with the fear itself, which is, I need this. I need to be afraid. Like I need to express this fear, and that's going to get me something. Sympathy, love. And we're not judging any of this. We can really just kind of see these opposing polarities and how they're both trying to achieve something important here. Like pushing away fear, you can explore that. If that's what's more prominent for you in the moment, you can explore, okay, what's the benefit of pushing this away? Or what's the worst that could happen if I fully express this fear? Because there is a benefit, right? There is a benefit to not being afraid. And it starts to connect with like all sorts of things like becoming more acceptable, right? Because if you're afraid, people might reject you. Might also start to connect with peace, because it's not very peaceful to be afraid. Literally, fear feels like the opposite of peace. So you might just get so frustrated, like, oh, I just hate this fear. I just want peace. I just want to be free from this fear. But why isn't it going away? Well, that's when you can explore, okay, what is the fear trying to give me? What if I express this fear fully? Ideally, what will I get? And if nothing comes to you, just remember that, just put an image up. Remember the helpless infant before language, before even any sense of self forms. How does that helpless infant get what it needs? How does it get the love and sympathy and attention that it needs? Expressing fear, right? Crying, being helpless, and really amping it up, really overemphasizing it. And we're not judging any of this. And we're not choosing which one is more okay or not. We're really seeing that, okay, both are okay. It's okay to not want to be afraid, right? It's okay to want to push it away. And the fear itself is also okay too. Right? Is it really that bad? The mind could say yes. And you can notice those beliefs. You can also notice the labels that the mind puts on top. Like I was saying earlier, for me, there was a label of intense. This is so intense. It was so interesting to explore that belief. And honestly, any words are a belief. So no matter, like whatever the mind says is a belief. So just to really simplify it, right? Belief is a position. It's a thought, which can always be reduced down to words. So belief is just words. But it's not just random words. It's not like just like some random words in the sky floating by. No, those words refer to me. So there's identity there. It refers to me. This fear is too intense for me. I just can't. So there's identity, there's words, there's emotion, belief. It feels very true. And you don't have to actually deny that belief. You don't have to like argue with it and try to convince yourself that it's false. Not necessary. Just looking at it. Just noticing and looking at it. Oh, that's a belief, that's a thought, that fear is too intense, that I can't handle it. And now you're sitting with it. So you're being with it, you're sitting with it, you're feeling whatever emotional energy is here. And you can go a step further. What do I get out of believing this? So like in my case, the belief was fear is very intense and I can't handle it. And what do I get out of believing that? Well, if I believe that fear is too intense, that it's very intense, strangely get something out of that. I actually get love. See, like the mind could judge it like that makes no sense. But if you trust yourself, oh yeah. If fear is intense, if I really overemphasize it, amplify it, then I get love. I actually get sympathy, attention. I also get a sense of control and survival because I need fear to survive. Okay? You see how I'm not arguing with it? I'm not saying, oh, and that's wrong, and here's why. Nope. It's almost like you're agreeing with it. Like, oh, that's what it is. Yeah, that's what it is. Okay. And then you don't move. You just stay right here, and you don't, like, not literally, like your body can move, but I just mean like, don't distract. Don't just jump right into another story, another whatever. Stay right here. Be present, because when that belief is looked at, accepted, acknowledged, dissolves, for a brief moment, there's just presence. There's just a neutral space. But the mind doesn't see it as special, even though like it's not special. I'm not saying that it's special. It actually feels very ordinary. But the mind is not able to distinguish that, okay, this is something, like there's something kind of worth exploring or feeling here. It's just almost like an absence of content. It's like we're like used to watching the TV, and then the TV turns off for a second or two, and the mind doesn't even know what the hell just happened. It's almost just like a blank space, like, oh, that's nothing. There's nothing there. But yeah, there's nothing there. And therefore, there's actually freedom. There's freedom in there not being any struggle. But when see, the ego is all about struggle, and ego is fueled by fear, really. And it's going to find something else to struggle against. And that something could be fear itself. And it might seem really strange to not have any struggle. It's almost like the restlessness just wants something. Just give me something, anything. And the thing is, you don't have to try to stop that. It's not about stopping that restless movement. You can actually just kind of be with it fully. If your mind gets pulled into thoughts, not a problem. It's always looking for something to do, something to push against, or something to crave and pull. Oh, I need that. And usually it's with other people, relationships, It's always seeking something from people. Validation, support, love. But really, it's trying to get safety, right? It's trying to fulfill that attachment, that wound. If only I can just find the right person. If only I can just get that validation that I really need. If only I'm seen. Oh, if only. It's like a carrot on a stick. You'll never get it. Not through trying. Not through seeking. But by feeling and staying curious to the pattern that's coming up for you. What is the seeking about? Can I feel it in the body? Can I just sit with this? Allowing any resistance. And in a very direct way, you'll actually start to feel more spacious and peaceful. But it's not going to happen through what the mind says or thinks. It's not going to happen through trying to get rid of the restlessness. It's not going to happen through getting anything from anyone, even this video from me. There's no information, there's no technique. It's very paradoxical, so it's like, why even watch these videos, right? I don't know. I think the value is that videos like this help to orient you towards yourself, inward, and to really accept and let go. And to also accept that you may not want to let go. So you see, it's really just like an unconditional acceptance. That's the goal of these videos, at least for me, is to kind of transmit this in my own way. But ultimately, this is something that has to happen with you, is to come into this acceptance over and over and over and over. Because what else are you going to do? What else is there to do, even? To keep struggling, to keep seeking? I'm not saying that you shouldn't do stuff, right? I'm not saying that you should just sit on your couch. But it's so easy to get lost in the seeking. So easy. Because we're wired essentially that way, right? We're fueled by these emotions. Sure, there's beliefs, of course, but it's fueled by emotions. If there were just thoughts with no emotions, none of this would be such an issue, right? So we're driven by these unconscious drives and emotions. And it's really hard, right? It can be really hard to just let it all go. So if we work with fixation, we work with resistance, we allow both sides and we explore. If there's an emotion, you want to allow the resistance, right? But you also want to explore what the emotion's trying to give you. Don't just feel it, because if you just let it, okay, I'm just going to feel this emotion. But there could be a hidden resistance that is like, oh, I can't feel this. So when you try to feel it, you're really pushing against that sense of I can't feel it. And then once you're feeling it, well, it's not going away. Like I allowed the resistance, but this feels stuck. Well, could there be a belief that I really need this, that I can't just let it go? Because if you're just feeling it, but there's a belief that I really need this, and it has to be intense, and I really need it, then feeling it is, it's not gonna fully resolve it, right? You have to see the belief that I need it. It's the only way, at least that I've found. It's all about beliefs, fixations. And these beliefs really feel like me because they really have been here as far as we can remember. Because early as memories started to form, beliefs started to form, identities started to form. It's okay. It's just how it is. But it doesn't mean that you're stuck. It doesn't mean that this is how it's always going to be. Yeah, it's a painful, lonely path. It's not a comfortable path, really. But it's not endless. It gets easier with time. But sometimes it just feels like hell. Surprisingly, I've noticed, and I've definitely been there many times, surprisingly, I've noticed that when it really feels like hell, like in the moment, it's terrible, right? It feels awful. But it's actually in those moments where the most growth happens. It's almost like we need that suffering to really maybe let go of something important that we don't want to let go of, to see something about ourselves that we don't want to see. And sometimes life just has to create these circumstances that honestly could not have been orchestrated better by anybody. Could not have planned things better. But in the moment, it can seem awful. In the moment, it can seem terrible. Well, yeah, I mean, it's uncomfortable, right? There's a lot of discomfort, uncomfortable feelings. But if everything was comfortable, if your life was perfectly comfortable, would you even want to do any of this? Would you want to grow? Would you want to inquire and learn about yourself and learn about who you ultimately are? What's the nature of myself? What's the nature of reality? Would you? There's something about suffering. Something that pushes you to go deeper. Because everybody has within us, everybody has this in Buddhism they just call it Buddha nature, but it's really just this potentiality to wake up, this seed almost of awakening. And everybody has this without any doubt. Everybody has this because we're all in the same, like we're all swimming in the same soup, right? So we all have the same nature. We all have the same potential. And sometimes it can seem like that's not the case. Even in the midst of hell, I can definitely tell you the potential is there. The potential for truth, the potential for freedom. And sometimes it's like there's nothing you can do to change your circumstances, and even the inquiry stuff, it's like none of this is really helping. Just feel it. That's all you can do. Just feel it and wait for it to pass. It's almost like an emotional storm just has to move through. It's always temporary. All right, I think I'm all over the place. Hopefully this is helpful.